the dissidents had to ask what the possibility of political action in a totalitarian society was. What is to be done and what is nothing to be done. And after an extraordinary exchange of essays between two countries, and even a couple of in-person meetings, which were really incredible, and you'll have to read the book when I finally finish it to learn more about those meetings. But they came up with this concept that being in confrontation with the regime was not the way to act politically. Being in confrontation with the regime was, it would only get you killed or imprisoned, but it also created a kind of false theory of the change that could be created. The confrontation wasn't going to bring about change. But what they decided to try to do is create parallel societies, parallel polis, that were alternatives to the society dominated by the totalitarian regime. And then in the best case scenario, when the totalitarian regime collapsed under its own weight, it would be there to take its place. There would be a working model of the future. And in the worst case scenario, if it didn't collapse under its own weight, they would have lived a political life. And so I'm looking at a number of contemporary projects that I think follow this framework of the parallel polis, although of course most of the people that I'm describing have never heard of the parallel polis, just as I'm pretty sure no one in this room had until I mentioned it. So this is, I'm going to read from a chapter about an organic farm in the West Bank. Ramallah traffic was haphazard and loud. Ringing in the city were Israeli checkpoints, both stationary and improvised. These made you wait your turn and then wait some more for baggage scans and car searches. The twisted geometry of roads on which Palestinians were allowed to travel caused every trip to take basically forever, if you were lucky enough, had the right documents, to get from here to there at all. Muhab drove a cream-colored and brown Volkswagen bus. Save for a tiny video camera rigged to the rear view mirror, the van, and Muhab and his passenger, who happened to be my daughter, both skinny, he with the beard and she with the long, loose hair and clothes 3 sizes too large, looked like throwbacks to the early 1970s. The van had curtains with an orange and brown abstract patterns. Those same curtains had hung in my childhood bedroom. They were made in the GDR. Somewhere in the hills, Muhab stopped abruptly, raising a small cloud of dust, then backed up into it. "There's some garbage we can use at the farm," he said in the monotone he's used when he spoke English. The two of them collected some giant corrugated cardboard boxes from the side of the road and shoved them in the bag. We continued on our way, the dust now settling inside the van. About 45 minutes after we left Ramallah, we pulled up to a microwave atop a stool in front of a chain-link gate. The appliance had been repurposed as a mailbox. From the road, Omsleiman Farm looked like the rest of the hills, grayish-yellow rocks with tufts of dry grass and a few low olive trees. Once we entered, I could see neat green planting beds, 3 incongruously large greenhouses, 2 makeshift shelters covered with tarpaulin, a kitchen and a sleeping tent with 4 narrow cots, and a bunch of structures that were only just beginning to rise from the ground. Multicolored wooden plaques marked territory. Section A had 17 beds planted with beans and zucchini. Section B had 16 beds. Section C was for clementines. A tiny pond was in need of plastering. The irrigation system that stretched out from the pond, thin metal pipes laid on the ground, needed fixing around the tiny walnut and pecan trees by the tent, and also needed to be extended to new beds. The large round pit in the middle would hold the foundation of a house. The bigger trees by the gate were papaya. There would be a harvesting shed and a small room for changing. Section E was 3 long beds and 3 olive trees. One of the greenhouses was functioning. It felt like a sauna inside. 2 more were waiting to be completed. A structure of nylon stretched over a metal pipe carpet with 2 trees. Mohab and my daughter laid the cardboard on the ground there, creating the nursery floor. Mohab's tour of the farm, conducted for my benefit, blended with the list of the month's tasks and chores he reviewed with my kid, his volunteer for the month. This list included creating a library of seeds and patching up a hole in the fence to keep wild boars out. "How good are you at welding?" Mohab asked politely. That day, Mohab taught her to assemble and lay irrigation pipes, to use elbow connectors to create turns. Fortunately, there was no welding involved. The fence was chicken wire, with a single string of barbed wire stretched across the top. I slipped through the hole used by the boars and found myself near the top of a stepped olive grove, or what used to be an olive grove. There were 3 dozen trees, far apart and unevenly spaced. It seemed that there used to be more. Standing with my back to the farm, I could see the wall in every direction. Straight ahead, at the bottom of the grove, it separated the hill from a smooth, paved, utterly empty road, one reserved for Israeli citizens. Dozens of white apartment buildings, 4 to 12 stories high, climbed the hill on the other side of the road, the other side of the wall. There was another road higher up on that hill, not yet paved, but rolled smooth by construction trucks, going back and forth. The road looked tightly stretched, naked. The right side of that hill had the same stripped bare look. It stood in wait of more gleaming white apartment buildings. To my left, the wall cut in. A dozen 6-story apartment buildings stood on the other side. To my right, the wall curved in and then back out, running around 2 more clusters of buildings in various states of completion. Some were just 1 or 2 stories with rebar protruding from the top. Some had finished shells with black square holes where windows would be. Construction cranes loomed over the clusters. Cement mixing trucks and dump trucks traveled to and fro. The wall looked like a Mobius strip. It surrounded me, yet I was unmistakably on the outside. I was in the village of Butler, legendary among people who followed the politics of the occupation. To my left, the wall was covered with giant graffiti. BDS, 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 BDS. The line of BDS broke for a very large, very tall gate, constructed apparently to allow the passage of army vehicles. The gate was black, not painted, but visibly, even from where I stood, charred. Butler had been protesting for more than a dozen years. The wall had cut the village in half, annexing land to Modi'in, the ever-expanding city of white apartment blocks. In February 2005, villagers started marching every Friday. After 2 years, Butler had won in Israeli court, which ordered the wall, then still more of a fence, moved back. It took another 4 years of protests to get the wall physically moved, and it still separated Butler from a third of the land that used to belong to the village. The protest continued. Every Friday, Butler residents, often joined by activists who came from Ramallah, the United States, and even Tel Aviv, marched through the village and to the wall. Most Fridays, Israeli soldiers forcibly dispersed the protests. Over the years, they killed at least 1 protester, injured several, and arrested hundreds. The land had long been bulldozed, and now the white apartment buildings surround it, part of what was fast becoming one of Israel's largest cities. The banging, knocking, clanging, and howling of construction was relentless, except on Saturday, which was Mohab's favorite day to work on the farm, because it was a quiet day. Mohab cooked lunch, fried eggs, farm vegetables, and bread for the 3 of us and 4 Butler men who had stopped by. He narrated the story of Suleiman farm in his English monotone. My daughter had pointed out that in Arabic his speech had all the inflections. Maybe someone had once told him to tone it down in English. A Jerusalem native, he had started out with a career in banking, then worked in distribution. He helped sell pharmaceuticals and cigarettes made by multinational companies. After 7 years, he decided to see the world. Everywhere he went In the Far East and in Europe, he found himself explaining Palestine to people. A group of teenagers he met in Portugal thought that Mohab was joking. They thought that Palestine existed only in the Bible. The people who knew that Palestine was an actual place still knew nothing about it. When Mohab returned from his travels and told his brother what kinds of questions he'd gotten, they decided that people needed to come visit Palestine. They started a hostel and called it the Hostel in Ramallah. They opened it in 2013, and people came. A lot from Europe, some from Japan, always a few from the United States and Australia, sometimes someone from Latin America. Young Europeans and sometimes Americans came and stayed as volunteers, cooking and cleaning at the hostel. Mohab and his brother Chris would drive them to Hebron, where a group called Youth Against Settlements led tours of the occupation, walking visitors through checkpoints, showing them the houses from which Palestinians had been removed, streets that had been sanitized of Palestinian presence, and the market that had to be covered with a metal net because settlers had kept throwing things at Palestinian traders and shoppers. The volunteers did their best to pass their new knowledge on to other guests. In 2016, a man who looked like an American backpacker, 30-ish, beard, long wavy brown hair in a ponytail, hiking boots, walked into the hostel. His name was Mohammed Abu Jayal. He came from New York, but was of Palestinian, Gazan origin. He had landed in Ramallah by accident, sort of, and was now stuck in a paperwork loop, trying to get out to see his parents in Gaza and return to his life in New York. When he wasn't knocking on some bureaucrat's door, he was talking to Mohab. Mohab had spent a lot of time thinking about and telling the story of contemporary Palestine. But now Mohammed talked about things Mohab had not considered, like how Palestinians in the West Bank were spending 200 million shekels a year on Israeli produce, how the requisition of Palestinian land had served the dual purpose of making Palestinians dependent on Israeli fruit and vegetables, and shackling them to wage labor at Israeli manufacturing plants, and how this, in turn, functioned as an instrument of political control, because work required travel permits and permits required obedience. Mohab knew that Israeli soldiers and settlers demolished Palestinian farms, burning olive groves, and razing farm structures on land that remained on this side of the wall. But he had not considered these attacks as the building blocks of a structure of suppression, rather than random acts of terror. Mohammed talked about Israeli control over the water supply, which made it almost impossible for Palestinians to farm, even when they had access to land. Mohammed talked about farming and about talking about farming. He said that his grandmother, a refugee, had told him stories about the farming life all the while he was growing up. He said that in New York he had studied farming, specifically CSA, or Community Supported Agriculture, which was farming by and for the people, without a middleman. Mohammed was an engineer, but the way he talked about farming made Mohab, former bank and marketing specialist, now hostel proprietor, want to become a farmer. I met Mohammed back in the States. It was during the first COVID year, and we walked outdoors in the permanent dusk of New England fall days, talking through our cloth masks. Mohammed said, "I always talk about living as the act of becoming." He was quoting the Brazilian educator Paulo Freire. Freire wrote about of becoming more fully human as a vocation, the conscious process that involves a growing, cultivated awareness of oneself and others. This is a close cousin of what the researchers of activism in Eastern Europe mean by political becoming. I had heard people talk about Mohammed as though he were the leader of a great movement, as though he had a proven ability to change the world. He could sound like that kind of man. He talked with little prompting. He was comfortable speaking for long periods without interruption. He made general pronouncements that sounded so polished, one got the sense he had used these phrases many times. He referenced his own record. "I have said," he said, or "I always say." But he did catch himself, and then he noted that he had started a farm that he couldn't even visit anymore, and a book group that used to meet on the Upper West Side of Manhattan. Those were his contributions so far to changing the world. Little things that came from some big ideas about the world as it ought to be. Muhammad was born in Saudi Arabia, but he wasn't a Saudi. His parents, both school teachers, had jobs there, though Muhammad's mother stopped working after the third of her 7 children was born. Every summer, the family went home to Al-Maghazi refugee camp. One of 8 camps in the Gaza Strip, Al-Maghazi was founded in 1949, 35 years before Muhammad was born. Muhammad was a refugee from Yasur, but he had never been to Yasur. Al-Maghazi was 40 kilometers, about 25 miles from Yasur. The village had been annexed to an Israeli airbase, and as far as anyone knew, stood fenced off and deserted. In 1948, it had a population of 1,241. By 1998, 7,622 people living as refugees hailed from Yasur. Most of them lived in Al-Maghazi. After the 1993 Oslo Accords, the family moved back to Al-Maghazi. They thought that a Palestinian state would soon be formed on Palestinian land. Muhammad's 2 younger siblings were born in the camp. Al-Maghazi was home, but not home. The shared goal of its 30,000 inhabitants was to leave the camp. It was the ancestral village in exile, but it was not a village. It was an agglomeration of concrete and cinder block. It was overcrowded, and there was never enough of anything: space, electricity, work. Muhammad and his brothers liked to play with asbestos chips they cracked off the roof of their house. There were 2 visions for the future. An aunt told Muhammad that the future was education. This future was elsewhere. An uncle said that the future was resistance. This future was here. In high school, Muhammad and his friends skipped classes to go throw stones at Israeli soldiers. It was the time of the Second Intifada. Several of Muhammad's friends were shot. One died. Muhammad's Al-Maghazi education began with Oslo and ended with this. Muhammad went to the United Arab Emirates on a scholarship to study engineering at American University. In 2004, he met Ashley, a girl from Arizona who was doing her year abroad in Dubai. They talked about marrying and staying in the region. Muhammad's family thought this was crazy. What boy from a refugee camp would not seize a chance to go to America? In 2007, he got his fiancée visa, and he and Ashley moved to Washington, D.C. Muhammad's first job was with a financial services firm that specialized in mortgage-backed securities, the exact sort of financial instrument that helped cause the financial and housing crisis that was already beginning. His next job was with a defense contractor. Then Muhammad and Ashley moved to New York, where he went to work as an engineer for MSNBC. In his first 5 years in the United States, Muhammad learned a lot about how the United States works. At every refugee camp, anywhere in the world, there are people who teach little kids about what they call democracy. At Al-Maghazi, American instructors had taught Muhammad about elections. He had imagined American democracy as some kind of perfect competition between opposing ideas. Now America was teaching him about itself, but also he found about Palestine. In 2008, soon after it became clear that Barack Obama would be the Democratic Party's nominee for president, Muhammad read an essay by Ta-Nehisi Coates. It was about the comedian Bill Cosby, then not yet a convicted rapist, but not so much about him as about ways to think about freedom, humanity, and the future. Muhammad could read it as an essay about Palestine, not because there wasn't enough written about Palestine, there was, but because Palestine, even when it was far, had always felt too close to analyze. The people in Coates' essay were familiar without being close. There were the people who said that personal responsibility, education, and self-betterment was the way. There were the people who externalized all the problems and said that protest was the way. In either case, you had to ask, the way to what? Coates wrote that if one acknowledged structural racism, it would follow that African Americans must on some level accept that their children will be less than until some point when white racism miraculously abates. This tacit consent to wait for justice seemed familiar, as did the good people who enforced this consent. A bunch of NGOs had turned Palestinians into a bunch of victims, Mohammed thought. Mohammed joined Black Lives Matter protests. At one of them, in Times Square, he was beaten by police. Later that day, they arrested him. In the evening, Rachel Maddow, the most popular host of MSNBC, showed a recording of a police officer pulling Mohammed out of a line of protesters and punching him in the face repeatedly. Maddow didn't know Mohammed worked at the channel. The next day, when Mohammed was released from jail, he pulled the footage Maddow had used. He took the tape to a lawyer who filed a lawsuit against the city of New York and its police department. Mohammed was working at 30 Rockefeller Plaza, a building that had a sitcom named after it. Every day he walked to and from work, past lines of people waiting to go up to the observatory on the roof or waiting to be allowed as audience guests at a live show. Gaza was under a blockade imposed by Israel and Egypt the year Mohammed came to the United States. Israel shelled al-Maghazi and Mohammed's parents had to flee. The news reached Mohammed in Ashley, Maine, at a summer camp run by Seeds for Peace, an organization that proposed to train future peacemakers. It was started in 1993, the year the Oslo Accords were signed. Its first trainees were approaching middle age, and peace was as distant as it had ever been. Mohammed was starting to suspect that Seeds for Peace was in the business of selling perpetual negotiation. But he was at the camp because Ashley worked for the group. At least she was trying to do something in the world. All Mohammed did was go to work in Midtown Manhattan. Once he had a lawsuit pending against the police, he didn't even feel like he could continue attending protests. Mohammed and Ashley decided to buy a house. They found one near Poughkeepsie, a town about an hour north of New York City. The house sat on 6 acres of land. Mohammed had no idea what one did with that. Palestinians called the kids from the refugee camps Felahim, peasants. But refugee camps were some of the densest urban environments in the world. There was nothing for a peasant to do there, except maybe listen to his grandparents talk about the way things used to be when they lived on their land and the land fed them. Mohammed's grandparents used to talk about having so much in the olden days that his grandfather was always giving food away. Mohammed found a place to study farming in Brooklyn. Now he spent 2 days a week working at Rockefeller Plaza and 3 days farming in Crown Heights. At the end of that year, Mohammed decided to go see his family in Palestine. The Israeli blockade of Gaza was in its 8th year. The fastest way to travel to the occupied territories is through Tel Aviv, a direct flight from New York, then a short taxi or bus ride to a crossing. But Palestinians who are not citizens of Israel, 5 million out of the 7 million Palestinians who live on land controlled by Israel, are not allowed to travel to or through Israel. They must enter the West Bank through Jordan and Gaza. They must enter the West Bank through Jordan and Gaza through Egypt, in the rare cases when they're allowed to enter Gaza at all. It did not matter that Mohammed was a U.S. citizen. Here, he was one of the 5 million. Mohammed flew to Amman and crossed the Alami Bridge from Jordan to Palestine. It was easy to enter. But Mohammed was now in the West Bank, not Gaza, and he was stuck. A Palestinian might be issued a permit to visit Gaza, but the authorities in Ramallah could issue such permits only to residents of the West Bank. Mohammed would have to ask the Israeli authorities outside the West Bank, but he could not enter Israel from the West Bank without a permit, and he could not get such a permit because he was not a resident of the West Bank. He did the dead-end rounds of bureaucratic offices for a couple of weeks and gave up. No way was he getting into Gaza. He had seen the West Bank. He should just go back to the United States. Now he found that he could not leave the West Bank at all, not even by way of Jordan. There was an Israeli checkpoint on that route too. He needed a permit, but as a Gazan, he could not get a permit on the West Bank. He would have to go to Gaza, but he could not go to Gaza. Mohammed was a hostage. He was also an exile. In Ramallah, he could be anyone he wanted. No one knew him here, but everyone knew someone who was like Muhammad in some respect. Muhammad could be a kid from a refugee camp, and people would know what that meant. But he didn't have to be that. Muhammad found the hostel in Ramallah. It took up the top 2 floors of a stone apartment building, less than 10 minutes by foot from the center of town. It was full of young Europeans. When Muhammad walked in with his tall backpack, he was an American. When he started talking to Muhammad, he was also a Palestinian. When you speak about things that are external to a language, like when you speak a language that is foreign to you, no matter how well you have mastered it, when you try to tell people about things they have never seen, smelled, tasted, or felt, the thing itself changes. You change. You are never quite what you say you are as you translate yourself again and again. Someone who has never lived in a foreign land or a foreign language might say that this is life. A thing described changes to fit its description. But life as an act of becoming accelerates when it is transported in language or place. You have no choice but to create yourself anew. When the bureaucrats weren't telling Muhammad that he was nobody, Muhammad was